Invasive species have their ways of traveling from their native lands to places they do not belong. And one organization is doing all they can to combat this problem head on. Joining me is Shikha Singh, coordinator and biologist for Jackson-Lenawee-Washtenaw Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. So that is a mouthful, but it's because you're doing a lot, and it's stuff that a lot of people probably don't even think about in their regular lives, but it's stuff that could be affecting their land that they live on.
Absolutely. And in the future, we do call ourselves JLW CISMA.
Okay.
Just to kind of shorten it up and make it easier to talk about. And CISMA is something that, because we got our grant in March, so now the entire state is covered, and each CISMA is responsible for a unit, a few counties together. So yeah, we're really excited now that the entire state of Michigan is covered. So if you see a problem, there is somebody in your region you can turn to, a CISMA, so to speak.
So like you would be a contact person for
Jackson, Lenawee, and Washtenaw.
Yep.
Correct.
And so why was it started? Why is this such an issue?
Well, a couple things. We really needed a regional group that people could turn to for information, and even also like the initial step, like, oh my God, what do I have in my backyard? What do I do? What's the next step? So we would be a good point for people to turn to help identify species, to kind of figure out how best to manage your issue that you are dealing with. Also, a big component to any environmental issue is education and outreach, to kind of highlight what invasive species are, how they can spread, and what the ramifications are to residents, businesses, etc.
Yeah, I think personally, I wouldn't really know if I had something in my yard that was invasive, because I don't know what all the native plants are to the area.
Exactly, and even I don't know all the plants and species as well. We know everybody has their specialty, and that's the great thing about being a part of a CISMA, is that you can tap in and share resources and share that knowledge and expertise. And we actually have a great array of partners that we work with as well. People that work in the aquatic industry, people that, the gardening clubs. We just share resources and knowledge, because, one person doesn't know everything. So it's really important to kind of share that information with others, and just to kind of to remind viewers what an invasive species actually is. It is a species that does not belong here. It's not native, but in addition to not being from here, it has to cause some type of harm. And this is a definition that we are using from the state. And so the types of harm could be environmental, it could be economical, or it could be to human health. So for example, for environmental, you could have an organism that comes in and it completely changes the environment. That's one example of an environmental harm. It can outcompete resources for the native species that people actually care about, and the organisms that live here that care about. That affects habitat, food, things like that, shelter. And then economic could be that it costs a lot of money to kind of remove these species, or these species cause some type of problem that could decrease property value. It could cost hundreds and hundreds and thousands of dollars to remove, for example, zebra mussels out of pipes. So that's something that could be considered an economical harm. And as far as human health, I mean, there's a couple of different varieties. And one basic example, zebra mussels, you're walking down the beach and you're stepping on all these hard shells that could hurt people. It could some of them could transmit diseases, or they facilitate, they may actually have a disease on them, but they could transfer it from one organism to another. So there's many different ways that human health can be impacted through invasive species.
And we actually can be part of the problem about the spreading of it, because there's different ways that invasives spread. And I'm sure some of it, we were talking about boats before the show. That's like a big aquatic one.
Right. There's two categories that we like to refer to with regards to spreading, intentional and unintentional. So the boat example is unintentional, generally speaking. When you're out there kayaking or boating, fishing, you don't really necessarily think about the other species. You're focused on getting your fish.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the examples of that for fishing is that, if you have your your live bait, some people will take their bait from one area, like fill their bucket and fish, but then decide that they're not getting enough bites, or for what other reason move to another lake and then again repeat the process there. But when they're done, they dump their bait, wherever they end up being last.
Yeah.
And so within that bait, it could be species that don't belong there, are not native to that area, especially if you're traveling, from city to city or different regions. And some of the problems is that, Asian carp is something that gets talked about. Some of the juvenile, it could resemble some of the minnows, etc. So they're too small to distinguish between them. So you may inadvertently take, by dumping your bait into another area, you may spread it that way. So that's unintentional. And then there's things like, plants that get stuck on the boat propellers, ballast water, which is a huge issue. And ballast water is a big thing because, from an even international perspective, we have things like the zebra mussels, the quagga mussels have come in via ballast water. So you have all these boats coming in from the seas, various oceans, and they come in and then they release their water. And then when they release that water, you could have a lot of organisms that you can't even see. Like the larvae of the zebra mussels, and so they spread that way, and so that's a concern, and that even happens in some of the smaller boats, the recreational boats as well. So that's one issue, the bait, and then and some of these plant fragments. I mean, you can just a small piece of that plant can actually transfer into another area and grow into an entire plant. So they're very, some of them are very, hardy. They grow really quickly.
I was going to say a lot of the invasive seems to spread really fast.
Right. And I like to use the example of, some of these invasive species are generalists. So, for example, a panda bear. If you took a panda bear and just dropped it, in Ontario, or you dropped it in Michigan, that panda bear might not be as successful as some of these other organisms because it has a specific food requirement, specific habitat. So it may not reproduce or grow as well as it would in its native land. But an invasive species are more generalist. They can tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions. They can eat a variety of foods or grow in different alkalinity. So that's what makes the invasive species so difficult to kind of prevent, because they're so generalistic and they can survive in a variety of conditions. So that's one example.
You actually brought some example photos of some of the things that we actually could see around here. So the first one that we have is what is it, Japanese stiltweed?
Stilt grass.
Stilt grass.
So it is a grass. This is something that has been found in Washtenaw County and in a couple other counties as well, Lenawee as well. It's very, very interesting because this plant was originally found in, I think, Tennessee in around 1919, 1920. That's when it was first, discovered, I believe, as an invasive species in the United States. And one of the interesting things about this plant was that it used to pack porcelain. When people were shipping porcelain from Asia to, United States, they would use this to kind of pack that material in.
Strange.
So, yeah, so somehow or other it got out, and it grows really quickly. But if you look at the picture again, you'll notice that the one I'm holding in my hand, that's just like a native grass. But the ones behind it, that is the stilt grass. And I chose that picture because it shows how similar it is. But then the Japanese stilt grass has a silver, almost a silver line down the middle of that blade. And so that's basically the differentiating factor.
Yeah. So you have to really be looking closely at these things
sometimes
to know that you have an invasive in your yard or around you.
Right. And I know I talk about it, and then people are like, oh, I think I have that. I'm like, oh, I don't know if you really have that. So look for that silver line down the middle of the blade. And that species, from a management perspective, it does have shallow roots, so you can pull that plant out via hand. One thing you can do if you have a larger area, you can mow it, but you need to do that prior to its seeding, which I believe is mid-August or something.
Okay.
If you mow too early, then it'll have a chance to kind of grow back again, and maybe earlier whatnot. So you want to really hit it right before it seeds, and that way you can kind of get rid of, because one of the concerns with that is that it does have a good seed bank. So all the seeds in the soil, so even if you get rid of it one year, I mean, it can grow back the next year because those seeds are still there.
So what else did you bring? You have parrot feather is one of them.
Parrot feather, yes. That is actually unfortunately, a pretty plant. A lot of these things are pretty. And I actually, just to kind of go back, keep the picture up, but the other thing is intentional introductions. We didn't touch on that one.
And that's when people find a pretty plant and they want to put it in their yard.
Exactly. So you take this plant, and purple loosestrife. That's another beautiful plant, and it looks really nice. But then again, it gets out of control. People, start putting them in different areas and outcompetes the native species. The parrot feather is actually one of those species, and it highlights a specific issue of people who have tanks. And when you have a lot of tanks, you have all these really exotic, really nice plants that look really pretty. And it's like, nice neon green, really feathery. I believe this is from native to Latin America. And what happens is that people, when they move, or when, end of the school year, teachers have, sometimes a classroom tank, and nobody wants to take it home, or nobody wants to move with a huge giant plant. So the people will just unfortunately empty it out into a river or lake. Like, oh, it's just a plant, or oh, nothing's going to happen. But it's incidences, like these that result in exotic plants coming in. And this plant is actually really interesting because even a small fragment of that plant can grow into another plant. So when you do if you have to kind of manually remove them, you have to get the entire plant, the entire root, because if you leave something behind, it can grow into another plant. And these things can actually grow about 1 meter above water. So they can be, pretty tall, and they create dense mats. So that could be something that impacts the environment because it can change the water flow. It can affect people's use of that water body. Nobody wants to swim through all this weedy, reedy areas. So that's one thing. And when we talk about tanks, there's a really cool program, Ripple. And that really addresses, you can look that one up, but that addresses the issue of, tanks, people dumping their stuff out. There are even stories about, various goldfish that are found swimming, and quite large, because if they find a nice warm area,
they'll survive.
Yeah. And, we have a lot of nutrients in the water, so that, if that's not a limiting factor, then you can imagine. Some plants do get killed off, because there is, over winter it gets cold, but some of them do not. So unfortunately, that's one of the issues with this.
All right, let's move on to Japanese knotweed.
Oh boy, Japanese knotweed is an awful plant. What can I say? This plant is the bane of a lot of people's existence. It can actually grow through, asphalt. It can grow through cement. It's a very hardy plant, and if you look at the one picture, you can kind of see my finger. That's like a stalk. It looks like a bamboo shoot. And people will, advertise it as, some sort of a bamboo, and it looks nice. It can create some privacy in the backyard if you have a neighbor. But again, a lot of people don't realize that it can damage the foundation of your house if it gets too close. It can grow through, and I know in the UK it's a very sensitive topic because people have a hard time selling their house because of this problem. Who wants to buy a house that has this kind of invasive species next to it? And so again, it's one of those things where it grows really quickly. You can mow an entire area down and it'll grow up really quickly. This has rhizomes, so this is actually kind of really fascinating. It has rhizomes, and so if you actually cut the plant in one area, it'll actually grow and send the shoot out somewhere else.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So it can spread very quickly. If it feels like it's stressed, environmentally stressed, and so you cannot just mow it or pull it to get rid of it. You have to get rid of the entire plant, which is very hard when it's underground and you can't see the roots.
And if it's growing through cement and stuff, you can't get the root.
Right, in some areas, yes. And they grow really really big. And I think that one of the pictures I had, I'm standing in front. It's like I'm 5'3", and it's so much taller than I am. So it grows really tall, really dense. Unfortunately, it can be kind of pretty. And I actually did find a food blog where somebody actually had come up with different ways to eat it. So, I mean, you know, like garlic mustard, there are some
I guess
creative
there's one
ways.
way to get rid of it.
Yeah, but again, you can't just cut it because
Yeah.
it'll grow back and it'll be worse than ever, and it spreads a lot. So,
You actually brought a picture of a healthy snail too, so that.
a heath snail.
So what is that?
So that is it's from Southeast Europe,
Mm-hmm.
and that's it. At first glance, it probably looks like a typical, you know, like a round garden snail, but this one is very flat.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at it, it's very flat, and it's got like the striations. And this is problematic because it does like crops, and which can impact our agricultural industry.
Okay.
So things like grapes and beans, and a host of other kinds of plants. So we definitely are worried about this. It has been spotted in Michigan in a couple different areas. It does like dry areas like hills, dunes is another place, open fields. So it can be found in those regions.
Okay.
And like with many snails, they can transport pathogens, etc. So we should be really careful about those and handling any snails of any kind.
And then you have the gypsy moth eggs that you brought.
Yes. So gypsy moth is something that I think a lot of residents, especially in Washtenaw County, are familiar with. I know in our region there are a lot of them. They, you know, this is like the egg sacs that I have a picture of, and I believe there are two regions or time of the year, sorry, that you can see these eggs. And so they do have egg masses present around February and March, and between like October, November, but it can also extend into like July and August. And we had a bunch of that recently, and so you can actually see those little pink splotches.
Yeah.
What residents can do is you can actually, you know, take a credit card, you kind of scrape them off the
And
tree.
they're usually on trees, or is it?
Right, they're on trees. And you actually, if you go to a tree, you can actually, if you look up, you'll be horrified to see that they're all, you know, on those under branches as well. So what residents can do is you can actually scrape them off. That's one way to kind of
And
minimize
that's like stopping them before they actually become the moth caterpillar.
Right.
Yeah.
So you want to get rid of them at that point. The other thing you can do is you can, you know, if you can tie like a burlap or some sort of like a material around the tree. And I think I have another picture of the gypsy moth, the caterpillar. And you know what? That's a good method as well, because the caterpillar will try to climb up the tree and it'll try to seek some shade or shelter when it gets really hot. So at that point, you can actually kind of brush them off into a bucket of soapy water, kind of get rid of them that way. So that's one thing. So there's a couple different ways that, you know, but the problem is really big. You might try contacting your local government to see if they have any program, if they're going to treat it any other way.
Well, and that's a good segue, because we were talking about, before the show, we were talking a little bit about what you do if you find something, and there's ways to report finding invasives.
Right. So there's a really cool app. You can download it on your phone, and you can also use it on the desktop. It's called the MISN app. So it's like the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, and you can actually go online, and you can like go to the app, and you can actually, you know, scroll through. Is it a plant or is it an animal? You can pick a category, and then again, if you click one, it'll have a bunch of varieties. It has pictures, so you can kind of be sure of what you are looking at, and you can actually click it and you can report it. You know, you use the GPS, you can click it, and the information will be sent to the state. So that's a really cool app. If you're out and about, another good thing you can do is you can take a picture, if you can, and it's safe to do so. You can take a picture of whatever organism you are seeing, and you can send it, you know, to me, your you know, the CISMA coordinator, and I can try to help you figure out what it is. And if I don't know, I have other resources or other people I can, you know, talk to as well. You can contact your state government. I mean, if you go online, there are, you know, is a nice list of who to contact for various types of species. But again, you know, you can feel free to contact me. We have a Facebook page that you can kind of go and post things as well.
Okay.
We have Twitter, we have Instagram. So that's something that people can do as well.
And is there anything else that we can do to prevent the spread?
One of the things is just to be aware of what you're doing and where you are. So for example, picture this, you know, you're taking your dog for a walk. You know, you get in your car, you know, put your dog in the car, and you go somewhere to a nice park. You go out, and what do most dogs do? They like to run around and go and like hide in like little shrubs area. And if you have an area where your dog's off leash, I mean, who knows what kind of ground they'll cover. And when they come back, you put your dog in the car, you go home, and then maybe your dog runs around the backyard. But what you may not see are some of the seeds or the burrs, or even some of the organisms that are attached to your pet. And you have just now taken it from one area to another. That's one example of how people have spread invasive species. So when you're out hiking, boating, anything, check your gear. Make sure that there's not any plants hanging off of any motors, or you're stuck to the side of your boat. So remove everything. Do an inspection. You can kind of wipe your boat down with a cloth. To combat aquatic invasive species, I mean, sometimes there are boat wash stations, using high pressure sprayers to kind of spray down your boat. That really helps as well. Another thing you can do is to, take your unused bait and dispose of it into the garbage instead of just dumping it back where you last fished. So those are some of the things that you can do. People are traveling. Make sure that you check your suitcases, that there's not any bugs or moths hidden around, because if they're various insects are attracted to food. And if you have gear, they might have eggs on it. So when you're going on vacation, you're coming back. That's why security is very strict about what kind of foods and stuff you can bring in, because you never know what kind of organism or insect is present in that. So that's just to be careful of what you have there. So those are some of the main things.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
No, thanks for having me. It's a great opportunity to talk about invasive species, and as I had mentioned, there are so many ways that people can spread it. So education is really important. Just be aware of what's around you, and if you see something weird that's out competing, your garden, taking over your garden, it's worth reaching out and asking for help.
It's never going to hurt to ask.
Correct. Yeah. And that's what we're here for.
For more on this and other programs, visit a2gov.org/watchctn. Thanks for watching, and tune in next time to FYI.